Hello, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your 2-stroke or 4, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support. Alright, so what this video is going to cover is one of the more interesting and obscure machines of the 1980s, at least here in the US, the 1986 Cagiva WMX 125. In Europe, this machine was certainly very prominent. It won the 1985 and 86 125 World Motocross titles back-to-back. But you just didn't see them here in the U.S. About the highlight of any U.S. interest was Mike Healy, I think in 1987, won the Golden State Nationals. And then I think maybe Marty Smith rode one, I'm thinking 82, 83. Really at the end of his career, he showed up at like 1 or 2 rounds, I think, on a Cagiva. Even then, people were like, a Cagiva? Head scratching their heads. They weren't mainstream motorcycles. Cagiva currently is no longer in production as a Cagiva. The current MV Agusta is what was Cagiva. Cagiva didn't start building motorcycles until 1978, and then they became very active in many different disciplines of racing. And as I said, it culminated in 85 with them winning the 125 World Motocross title with Pekka Vähkönen at the controls. Davey Strybos backed that up in 86. The machine we're going to cover here won the title again. So even though they were very successful in Europe, they're really obscure here. Now, you may not realize it. You probably are familiar with Cagivas in that in 1987, Cagiva bought Husqvarna, and then all the Husqvarnas going there forward, except for a couple of maybe leftover years where they kept building some of the enduro bikes and kept some of the Swedish designs for a few years. All those are really Cagivas. In the 90s, all the Cagivas rebranded as Husqvarna, and all those bikes, Jackie Martin's went on, Alessio Chiodi, all those are really Cagivas. They're Italians, even though they say Husqvarna on them, they're not. They basically stayed Cagivas until, I don't know, mid-2000s when BMW bought them, I think, is who actually bought them from Cagiva. So, in any case, those bikes, even though they weren't called Cagivas, really were. So, if you've ever ridden like a 90s Husqvarna or a 2000s Husqvarna, you've probably ridden a Cagiva in one way or another. Now, this is early days, though. This bike, as I said, is not well known. These early Cagivas didn't get a lot of press. They were rarely put in motorcycle magazine shootouts and stuff, so most people didn't know a lot about them. And like I said, they're very obscure. Most of you out there probably have not ridden this motorcycle. There aren't a ton of them out there. So I thought it'd be good to go back and highlight one of these more interesting and certainly more obscure machines of the 1980s. So here's the story of the 1986 Cagiva 125 WMX. Today, the name Cagiva is probably best remembered in the motocross world for its purchase of Husqvarna in the late 80s. Once the owners of Husqvarna, Ducati, and MV Agusta, Cagiva was a motorcycling powerhouse in the 80s and 90s. Founded by Giovanni Castiglione in 1950, the Cagiva brand was originally a manufacturer of small metal components. The name Cagiva was derived from the combination of the founder's name and the town in which it was originated, Varese, Italy. It was not until much later in 1978 that Cagiva actually expanded into motorcycle production. At that time, American motorcycle manufacturer AMF Harley-Davidson had a substantial motorcycle production facility in Varese, building small 2-strokes for sale under the Harley banner. Seeing an opportunity to expand their business, Castiglione's 2 sons decided to diversify the company's offerings by acquiring the AMF Harley-Davidson factory and starting to build motorcycles themselves. Initially, the new Cagivas were nothing more than rebadged AMF Harleys, but eventually the Italians began producing unique machines of their own. Early Cagiva machines were very unique. They certainly had a very interesting appearance. Let's say the Italians had their own idea about styling, and these bikes certainly were unique. Their motor performance, though, was never in question. They knew how to make horsepower, and the machines were never lacking in forward thrust. In America, they remained a little more than a curiosity, however. Occasionally, they would show up in magazine tests and the odd U.S. Grand Prix, but most of the time, they were almost impossible to find, and you just didn't see many out in the wild. It was just not common. During this era in the early 80s, America had pretty much fallen out of love with machines from Europe, and they had fallen in love with the machines from Japan. Bikes like the RM125, CR125, they were hugely popular, and bikes from Cagiva, Husqvarna, Mako, pretty much all the old world European brands had kind of fallen out of favor over here. It wasn't until 1985 that Cagiva really broke into the motocross mainstream by winning the 1985 125 World Motocross title. Finland's Pekka Vähkönen accomplished this feat and took home the first 125 world title for a non-Japanese brand. Amazingly, Suzuki had won every world title since the series was started in 1975. Pretty much an indication of just what a powerhouse Suzuki was in the late 70s and early 80s. It was pretty amazing that nobody else had even sniffed at the title other than Suzuki over those years. This was a major achievement for Cagiva, They even captured the third spot on the podium with Corrado Madi, who was an Italian rider, rounding out the top 3 in the 125 standings. In a mere 7 years, Cagiva had gone from a producer of rehashed Harley street bikes to the winners of one of the most prestigious motocross series in the world. For 1986, Cagiva looked to capitalize on this impressive victory by introducing a World Championship replica version of the bike that took Vakkonen to the 1985 title. The new machine was based loosely off the 85 design, but featured several changes aimed at improving its performance. Revisions to the frame, suspension, bodywork, and motor all looked to increase the appeal of the WMX to the American market and bring the Italian stallion up to speed with its Far East rivals. While the WMX was certainly different than the Japanese machines in many ways, it was not behind them in terms of technology. The 124.6cc two-stroke motor was as up-to-date as anything available in the class in 1986. The motor featured a 56 by 50.6 mm bore and stroke and an 11:1 compression ratio from its single-ring piston. Internally, the 86 cylinder featured all new porting and the same high-tech Nikasil liner as the new Hondas in 86. Like the Japanese 125s, the WMX featured a variable exhaust valve designed to broaden the power. This Italian version of a power valve was coined the Cagiva Torque Increase System, or CTS. It featured a sliding guillotine valve that varied the exhaust port timing based on engine RPM. This was similar in theory to Yamaha's YPVS power valve system, although the Yamaha used a rotating drum instead of the Italian's guillotine valves. For 1986, the CTS was massaged slightly and featured a redesigned mechanism to offer a smoother engagement. On the intake side, Cagiva kept things close to home by speccing an Italian-built 36mm Dell'Oro carburetor for the mixing duties. The intake remained a conventional cylinder redesign, but new reeds for 86 promised quicker response. The ignition duties were handled by an electronic motoplate unit that featured an automatic timing advance. And finishing off the motor changes for 86 were a redesigned pipe and silencer combo that were tuned to work with the new motor's power characteristics. In the chassis department, the 1986 WMX featured an all-new 4130 chromoly single down-tube frame. Unlike many Japanese bikes of its time, the Cagiva's frame featured a fully removable subframe that made servicing the shock much easier. This was something found in the Honda CRs, but most of its Japanese competitors still were using some manner of a single-sided bar as opposed to a fully removable subframe at this point. Complementing the new frame was redesigned bodywork that slimmed and flattened the pilot's compartment. The new tank featured a lower center of gravity to aid handling and a lower profile on top to aid rider movement. A redesigned saddle for 1986 carried much farther up the tank and featured a slightly softer but still ridiculously hard seat foam for improved rider comfort. Finishing off the rider compartment was a set of Trick alloy aluminum bars, and this was almost 20 years before any of the Japanese would start putting alloy bars on their bikes. On the suspension end of the equation, the Cagiva featured high-end European components both front and rear. Up front, the WMX featured a very unique set of 42mm conventional Marzocchi forks that delivered 11.8 inches of overall travel. These forks allowed for both compression and rebound adjustability, a feature not seen on any of the Japanese competitors in 1986. These forks were very unique for the time, and featured an early version of the separate function fork design that would come into vogue almost 20 years later. The Marzocchi forks featured a single spring, with compression damping being handled by one fork and rebound damping being handled by the other. Out back, the WMX featured a version of a rising rate single shock suspension system Cagiva called Soft Damp, which is quite an interesting name for the suspension. I imagine maybe it has a little different connotation in Italian, but seems like a strange choice. This bottom link design was similar to what was found on bikes like the Honda CR125 and featured a premium Swedish Öhlins damper. The shock offered 12.2 inches of travel, with adjustments for compression and rebound damping available. For 1986, new valving specs were added to improve its performance. On the track, the 1986 WMX 125 proved a potent competitor to its Japanese rivals. By far its best trait was its powerful motor that delivered a very strong mid-range blast. There was not a lot of thrust above or below this surge, however, so care had to be taken to keep it in this sweet spot. This was similar to the way the new 86 YZ125 ran. It offered a very similar strong mid-range blast and a very short pull. When it was on the pipe, it was as fast as anything available in 1986, but it took a talented rider to make the most of its punchy power profile. For 1986, the power was slightly broader than the 1985 WMX, which was very pipey, but it remained a demanding engine to use effectively. Both the transmission and clutch were well liked though, and that helped riders make the best use of its narrow power spread. In truth, there really wasn't much of a contest for power band supremacy in 1986. The CR125 dominated the standings with by far the widest power band and most power. All the other 125s, including the Cagiva, were competitive, but each one had issues that made them challenging to ride fast. Only the Honda covered all the bases, and that's really the main reason it dominated the standings in '86. In the right hands, the Cagiva's power plant was certainly competitive with its Japanese rivals, and that was no small feat for a European 125 at that time. While the Cagiva's motor was a contender, the same could not be said of its stock suspension package. On paper, the WMX offered the most sophisticated suspension components in the class, but that did not translate to winning performance on the track. Its Marzocchi M1 forks and Öhlins shock were some of the most advanced units available, but their setup from the factory was completely at odds with what most American riders had come to expect from their Japanese machines. Of course, much of this was probably due to the extreme differences found at the time between the tracks in Europe and America. If the Italians would have had the infrastructure to properly test and set up their machines just for the American market, they probably would have fared better. But as it was, the bike setup was not really what people were looking for over here. In stock condition, the forks were softly sprung and very heavily damped. This is a problem Honda would face a few years later with their switch to inverted forks. In both cases, riders were not impressed with the performance this setup provided. The forks action was incredibly harsh and unforgiving on small chop, and equally wrist-busting on hard hits. They hung down in the stroke and hit a valving wall when encountering the sharp types of hits common to a motocross track. Several testers tried experimenting with the Marzocchi's mini adjustments, but none of them found an acceptable setting. With stiffer springs installed and a proper revalve by a tuner familiar with the unique Italian forks, there was certainly a lot of potential available, but in stock condition, these were easily the worst forks in a very mediocre '86 field. In the rear, the situation was not quite as dire. Once again, the spring rate was too light for most testers' tastes, but the shock's action was not as grim as the forks. In stock condition, it tended to kick on stutter bumps and was generally busy in action, but with careful setup and a spring swap, it performed well enough at least to be raceable. No one really loved the shock, but at least it was usable and offered a great deal of potential if it was properly sorted out. On the handling front, the WMX was a middle-of-the-road contender. Turning was about on par with the YZ and better than the KX, but not nearly as precise as the Honda CR. On fast straights, it resisted the urge to shake its head like a Honda, but it was not quite as planted as the Yamaha. Here, the poor suspension did not work in the Cagiva's favor. In the air, the WMX was a neutral flyer, but most riders found its quote-unquote sit-on layout and rock-hard seats slightly off-putting. Today, of course, both of these features would be pretty much par for the course. All modern machines use a very sit-on-top layout and a very hard seat, but in 1986 that was not the case. Most bikes at the time had a more like a sit-down banana seat kind of a feel to them, and marshmallow seats. The Cagiva was actually very far ahead of its time in this way, but at the time riders were a little bit put off by this feel. One area where the WMX was lacking compared to its rivals was in the braking department. Up front, the Cagiva used a single-piston Brembo disc brake, and out back there was a single leading shoe drum. In terms of technology, this was actually not that far behind the times. Only the KTM and the Kawasaki in '86 had a rear disc. But in terms of performance, the Cagiva was behind its rivals. Neither the front or rear brake were very powerful. Both of them offered a very wooden feel, and they tended to glaze over the pads and the shoes pretty quickly, meaning you had to take them out and service them regularly. Any kind of a aftermarket brake pad would have been an important upgrade in 1986 on the Cagiva. Definitely benefited from like an EBC or something like that. On the detailing front, the Cagiva was very well appointed for its time. It had stock Renthal bars, Domino controls, and high-end suspension hardware that were all premium quality items that would have cost extra to add to any of its Japanese rivals. The seat foam, while hard as concrete, was very long-lasting. I talked to Mike Healy about his personal Cagiva, and he said the one thing that was good about it was the seat foam would last all season, and by the end of the year, the seat was finally comfortable. I did get a chance to ride one of these personally. Actually, a year or two after this, a buddy of mine was an importer of Cagivas and ATKs and other weird machines, and he let me ride his 88, and I was real impressed with it. The motor was very punchy. It was very fast, easily as fast as my CR125 I had at the time, although the power was narrower. The thing that really struck me was just how weird it felt. As I said earlier, you sat kind of on top of the bike, and when you sat down on it, it felt like, you just didn't sit down, you didn't squish down into the seat and stuff. And at the time, it was just weird. Pretty much any bike you rode, had a real soft marshmallowy seat, and you kind of sat down in it. And as I said, if you got on a modern KTM, it wouldn't feel that much different than this. But in '86, that was a weird thing that, like I said, put off a lot of people. Overall, the Cagiva was well put together. There were some little niggly things. The stock silencer tended to break the bracket. There was a little rubber grommet that tended to fail a lot. Also, the packing didn't last very long. The bike did come with a full, complete set of spares, though, including a alternate gearing for the rear end. That was a good thing because the stock gearing was pretty tall, and it definitely benefited from gearing it down a little bit to help you keep it in that sweet spot. But overall, the bike was, very comparable in terms of quality for the time. If you rode in the mid-'80s, most of the bikes had issues, and the reliability and the durability just wasn't there like it is on a modern machine for sure. Any of these bikes tended to get ratty pretty quick if you didn't take care of them. In the end, the 1986 Cagiva 125 WMX proved that Europe could indeed compete with the Japanese in the 125 class. The World Championship replica offered a strong motor, solid handling chassis, and top quality components. If only it had offered a small amount of suspension finesse, it might have given its Nipponese competitors a run for the money. But as it stood, it was a fork and a shock away from running at the front. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the 1986 Cagiva 125 WMX. It's a machine that I think a lot of people either don't know a lot about or think poorly of. I think the fact that here in America they were just rare certainly hurt them. They never really caught on any great numbers. A lot of people also harbor a little bad will because of the way the whole Husqvarna thing went down. When Husqvarna was bought in 1987, Cagiva really didn't have much of a dealer network here in the U.S., and they allowed the parts to basically run out because they didn't want to spin any new components before they updated and started building their own parts. I know a friend of mine had a Husqvarna 430 Auto, and he couldn't get parts for it at the time. It really was a problem. I think that's the main thing. There just really wasn't the infrastructure here in the U.S. to make these a viable machine. If you bought one, it was difficult to get parts for them. There weren't many dealers to begin with, and even if there were dealers, it was hard to get stuff for them. So any kind of situation like that's going to torpedo. I think that's probably a lot of what happened to some of these European brands. They just did not have the infrastructure that the Japanese did. They're always much better logistically. In general, you have no problem getting a part for your Honda CR or whatever, but if you had one of these more obscure, quirky brands, even KTMs at the time, I think it was a little more difficult to find stuff for, and it definitely did not help them break into the mainstream, at least here in the U.S. They were building a fair amount of machines. They just weren't being sold here in the U.S. So considering the U.S. is the biggest market, that probably wasn't great. In the 90s, actually, Cagiva would go on and basically be sold as Husqvarnas. After 1990 or so, I think, they basically stopped selling the Cagivas as Cagivas, and all the ones in the 90s and early 2000s, those Huskies are really Cagivas. Cagiva just rebranded all their motocross content to use the Swedish name, so they lived on and became probably more popular as Husqvarnas. Certainly, it took the Austrians to finally make Husqvarna more of a mainstream brand here in the U.S. again, but Cagiva, like I said, I don't think they necessarily get a fair rap. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. I've done classic reviews of all kinds of motorcycles, both Japanese and European. I just did one not too long ago on a KTM, 87 KTM. I also did just a retrospective on the history of the KDX and a bunch of other interesting stuff. So if you could share this on social media, give it a like and a share, I'd very much appreciate it. Until we meet again, this is Tony Blazer. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.